Snow fell in thick, silent sheets, muffling the distant thunder of artillery. The pines stood like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with ice. Beneath them, the ground was frozen solid, the kind of terrain generals called tank-proof. German officers had said it for years. No armored column could ever cross the Ardennes. But somewhere beyond the fog, engines were waking. The low growl of 1,000 Shermans began to roll through the mist like approaching thunder. U.S. crews, faces wrapped in scarves and frost, checked their periscopes, loaded shells, and waited for the signal. The air stank of fuel, oil, and cold metal. In command tents miles behind, maps showed what no one thought possible. A counteroffensive through the very forest Germany once used to surprise the world. Now, the Americans would return the favor. As dawn broke, the white fog began to vibrate. Snow shifted. The forest trembled. The myth of the impassable Ardennes was about to be crushed under 30 tons of American steel, one tank at a time. The Germans had written off the forest. The Americans were about to write history in it. The Ardennes forest, a vast stretch of rugged hills, narrow valleys, and dense pines straddling Belgium, Luxembourg, and northeastern France, had always been treated as nature's fortress. During both World Wars, its twisting roads, steep ravines, and unpredictable weather made it a nightmare for armored movement. Snow and mud turned paths into traps. Fog erased visibility. Rivers like the Our and Sur cut deep through the terrain. To most generals, it was a wall, not a road. For decades, the German General Staff had repeated one mantra: no tank army can cross the Ardennes. The same belief had shaped Allied planning. The forest was considered a natural barrier, so strong that even reconnaissance patrols hesitated to venture far into its depths. Ironically, it was Germany itself that had once proven this assumption wrong. In May 1940, during the invasion of France, German panzer divisions had threaded through the very same forest, bypassing the Maginot Line and collapsing French defenses in days. Yet, 4 years later, as the war turned against them, German leaders convinced themselves that the Americans could never pull off what they once had. By late 1944, the Western Front had settled into a deadly rhythm. The Allies had landed in Normandy in June, liberated Paris in August, and were grinding east toward the German border. The Wehrmacht was retreating, but not broken. In the Ardennes sector, U.S. forces were thinly stretched, resting, refitting, or holding quiet sectors considered safe. Intelligence called it a ghost front. Then came December, Hitler's last gamble. The Ardennes Offensive, or what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a surprise counterattack with more than 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks. They struck through the same forest that was once impassable, catching the Allies off guard. Their goal? Split the Western Front, seize Antwerp, and force a peace on Germany's terms. The opening days were chaos. American positions shattered under the sudden assault. Entire divisions, green troops and veterans alike, were surrounded or overrun. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne dug in and refused to surrender, holding the line in freezing conditions. The weather grounded Allied air power. Supply convoys froze in snowdrifts. Tank crews huddled in foxholes, listening to the growl of approaching German armor. For the first time since Normandy, the U.S. Army faced a real threat of being pushed back. Yet, beneath the confusion, something else was forming. A coordinated response unlike anything the Germans expected. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, saw through the smoke. Instead of scattering, he ordered a counterstroke. The key would be mobility, and no one embodied that doctrine better than General George S. Patton. At that moment, Patton's Third Army was facing east, locked in heavy fighting along the Saar. To strike north into the Ardennes meant turning an entire army. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, tanks, fuel convoys, and artillery by 90 degrees, across frozen roads and winter storms in mere days. Military textbooks called such maneuvers impossible. Patton called them Tuesday. In a single night, his staff redrew the maps, rerouted supply columns, and mobilized engineers to prepare the roads. Every Sherman tank that could still move was fueled, armed, and sent north. The orders were simple: relieve Bastogne, crush the German advance, and take back the forest. The Germans, convinced the terrain would protect them, had no idea what was coming. By December 19th, Patton's armored columns were already rolling. The forest that once swallowed armies began to echo with engines, tracks, and shouted commands. One by one, the myths of the Ardennes began to fall, under the steel treads of American tanks. By December 20th, 1944, the map of Western Europe looked like a wound. The German counteroffensive had bulged deep into Allied lines, a 50-mile spear thrust aimed at splitting the American and British armies apart. Snowstorms and low clouds kept Allied aircraft grounded. Convoys were ambushed. Bridges were blown apart. But under that same blinding snow, the U.S. Army's response was gathering speed. At the center of it stood General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army. For weeks, his armored divisions had been fighting in Lorraine, hammering through German defenses toward the Siegfried Line. When Eisenhower summoned him to Verdun on December 18th, few expected what followed. As staff officers debated how to respond to Hitler's surprise attack, Patton calmly announced that he could pivot 3 full divisions north within 48 hours. The room fell silent. No one believed it. But Patton had already issued preliminary orders before the meeting even began. He knew speed was everything. The Germans had gambled everything on weather and surprise. If the Americans could break through fast enough, they could trap the enemy's spearhead before it reached the Meuse River. The Ardennes, however, was the worst possible terrain for such a move. The region's roads were narrow, twisting, and choked with snow. Tank tracks slipped on ice. Hills forced vehicles into single-file lines that stretched for miles. Fuel was scarce, and every bridge could become a bottleneck or a death trap. Yet the U.S. engineers, the quiet miracle workers of the front, began carving paths through the wilderness. In freezing winds and waist-deep snow, they bulldozed new routes, shored up weak bridges with timber, and laid steel matting over icy slopes. Pontoon crews fought river currents to build crossings for armor, sometimes under artillery fire. Behind them, fuel trucks rolled forward, each gallon of gasoline guarded like gold. Without it, the Shermans were nothing but steel coffins. Meanwhile, intelligence units pieced together the German plan. Reports showed that the enemy had committed its last reserves, including elite SS Panzer divisions, but lacked fuel for a long fight. The offensive depended on capturing Allied depots. Every day the Americans held, the German timetable slipped further into disaster. The 4th Armored Division, Patton's spearhead, led the charge north toward Bastogne. The temperature dropped below freezing. Engines stalled. Men wrapped blankets around turrets to keep them warm. Convoys crawled through fog so thick headlights were useless. Yet, the drive never stopped. To the east, the 10th Armored Division moved through Luxembourg's mountains, their Shermans straining on icy slopes. To the west, infantry divisions cleared pockets of resistance, securing crossroads and villages vital for supply. The forest echoed with the rhythm of chains, treads, and shouted coordinates over radio static. Inside Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne Division held its ground under constant shelling. Supplies were low. Medics worked in frozen cellars. Paratroopers fought from foxholes carved into ice. When the Germans demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: Nuts. That defiance became a rallying cry for every soldier heading north. The men in the Shermans heard it over the radios. It wasn't just about saving a town anymore. It was about proving that no terrain, no winter, no ambush could halt American momentum. By Christmas Eve, Patton's columns reached the outskirts of Bastogne. The first relief tanks of the 4th Armored Division broke through enemy lines near Assenois, smashing into the German ring that had strangled the town for a week. As the lead Sherman burst through the smoke, paratroopers cheered from foxholes, exhausted but unbroken. The relief of Bastogne was more than a tactical victory. It was a signal to the world that the German offensive had failed. But the counterattack wasn't over. What began as a rescue would now turn into a full-scale pursuit. 500. Shermans pushing through the same forest the Germans once believed no tank could cross. The snow was still falling. The fog still clung to the valleys. But now, the thunder came from the west. Every photograph from that winter tells the same story. Exhaustion etched into young faces, half hidden by scarves, snow crusted over helmets, eyes squinting through frost on periscopes. The Sherman crews lived in their tanks like iron coffins, where the temperature inside could drop below freezing. Men slept sitting up, boots stiff from ice. Engines were kept idling through the night, so they wouldn't freeze solid. When rations ran out, they thawed frozen cans of beans over the engine block or melted snow in their helmets for water. The forest that once terrified them became familiar, a world of white and shadow, where they carved a path inch by inch. Each sunrise felt like defiance. Each mile forward meant one step closer to ending the war. The M4 Sherman had never been the most feared tank on the battlefield. Against the German Panther and Tiger, it was outgunned and under-armored. But what the Sherman lacked in raw power, it compensated with something more important: adaptability. By late 1944, the Americans had refined their machine into a war-winning tool. The new M4A3E8 EZ-8 featured a 70 cm high-velocity gun, improved horizontal volant suspension, and a more powerful Ford V8 engine, perfect for rapid advances over rough ground. Its lighter weight allowed it to cross bridges and frozen rivers that German panzers couldn't risk. Each Sherman carried a 5-man crew: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Inside, space was tight but efficient. Radios linked tanks into platoons, platoons into companies, and companies into divisions, giving the U.S. Army unmatched coordination. While German armor relied on ambush and shock, the Americans relied on momentum. Maintenance crews worked miracles. Damaged Shermans were repaired within hours using field welding, salvaged parts, and brute ingenuity. The logistical network behind them, trucks, depots, pipelines, fuel dumps, turned the American Army into a self-sustaining machine. In the Ardennes, the Sherman's reliability became its greatest weapon. While German tanks froze, ran out of fuel, or broke down in mountain passes, the Shermans kept moving. Engineers mounted wooden planks on tracks for traction, used bulldozers to tow them through drifts, and even wrapped treads with chains for grip. Where the Germans saw an impassable forest, the Americans saw a challenge of engineering. Every time a Sherman's tracks bit into the ice and pushed forward, it wasn't just metal moving. It was the weight of an entire industrial empire forcing its way through Europe. When history speaks of the Battle of the Bulge, it often returns to one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war: Patton's 90-degree turn. In military terms, such a move was audacious to the point of insanity. Armies do not simply pivot entire fronts in days. They take weeks to coordinate routes, fuel, and supply. But Patton's staff, the famed Third Army headquarters, had been planning such contingencies since the summer. His motto, "always ready to move in any direction at any time," was not a slogan. It was doctrine. Within 48 hours, 3 divisions, the 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry, changed axis and began moving north into Belgium. Convoys clogged the roads, but military police kept the flow like arteries. Bridges were reinforced overnight, engineers guiding tanks by flashlight. Columns moved through darkness, their only light the red glow of tail lamps vanishing into snow. Patton's command philosophy was simple. Momentum kills confusion. He believed hesitation was deadlier than enemy fire. His orders cut through the bureaucracy. Push, push, and keep pushing. Fuel shortages, broken transmissions, and ice were obstacles to be solved, not reasons to stop. German intelligence never expected such speed. Their field reports describe panic. American armor advancing through sectors previously considered impassable. By the time Wehrmacht command reacted, the Third Army was already striking at their flanks. In less than a week, the tide of the entire offensive had turned. The same roads the Germans had once used to surprise the world were now filled with columns of American Shermans, roaring toward them from every direction. From inside the German command bunkers, disbelief spread faster than orders. Reports arrived in fragments. American armor pushing north through snow, supply convoys appearing on roads thought unusable, bridges holding under weights they were certain would collapse. To the officers who had planned the Ardennes offensive, the impossible was happening in reverse. The German plan had relied on terrain as much as tactics. Hitler and his generals believed the forest would slow Allied response long enough for their panzers to seize fuel depots and reach the Meuse River. Their Tiger and Panther tanks, though powerful, were designed for open fields, not twisting mountain roads. Once the skies cleared and Allied mobility returned, the offensive began to choke. By Christmas, radio operators from the front lines reported desperate shortages. Fuel trucks abandoned on frozen roads became torches in the night. Panthers sat idle, their engines silent. Crews huddled inside for warmth. What had begun as a bold strike turned into a logistical nightmare. Then the rumbling began. Not from German engines, but American ones. Shermans appeared through the mist, often in groups of 20 or 30, moving like a single machine. German infantry, already exhausted, faced tanks emerging from directions their maps didn't even mark as roads. Officers stared at their situation maps, watching their once proud spearhead shrink by the hour. One Wehrmacht major reportedly muttered, "They fight the forest itself." Another called the Americans mechanized ghosts. The Germans had used surprise to start the battle. Now they were being consumed by it. The Ardennes, which they had counted on for protection, became a trap. Its narrow valleys funneled their retreat. Its frozen rivers blocked their escape, and its fog now hid the enemy instead of them. By early January, German commanders faced the truth. The same forest they once called armor-proof was now echoing with thousands of enemy tracks. The myth had turned on its makers. Behind every tank that reached Bastogne was a miracle of logistics. The Ardennes was never meant for war machines. Its thin dirt trails, medieval villages, and icy ravines made transport a nightmare. Yet the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers turned this frozen wilderness into an operating theater of modern warfare. Bulldozers pushed through drifts taller than men. Bridge units threw steel planks across frozen creeks, sometimes under sniper fire. When roads became impassable, engineers blasted new ones through rock and timber. The freezing cold turned mud into stone, a curse for infantry, a blessing for armor. Fuel convoys ran around the clock. Mechanics worked under tarps lit by lanterns, replacing tracks and engines with numb fingers. Supply trucks carrying ammunition and food moved in endless columns from depots as far as Reims and Verdun. The Red Ball Express, the legendary U.S. supply line, was rerouted north, feeding the advancing tide. Communications teams laid miles of telephone wire through the forest, connecting divisions with command posts in real time. Field hospitals followed close behind, setting up in churches, barns, even frozen ditches. Every wounded man could be reached, every tank refueled, every gun resupplied. It was a war not just of courage, but of coordination. While the Germans relied on isolated pockets of strength, the Americans wielded a network, industrial, mechanical, and human, that stretched from the Ardennes to the factories of Detroit. In that web of steel and sweat, the line between front and rear blurred. Everyone, from engineers to cooks, became part of the offensive. Every shovel of snow cleared was another yard for the Shermans. Every gallon of fuel delivered was another mile closer to victory. The Ardennes didn't just test soldiers. It tested the entire system that sustained them. And it held. Leadership in the Ardennes wasn't just about tactics, it was about morale. The conditions were cruel, the odds shifting daily. And yet the American command structure never fractured. General Eisenhower's calm coordination from chef headquarters set the tone. No panic, no blame, only response. He trusted his field commanders completely, giving them freedom to act while keeping the larger strategy unified. It was decentralized warfare at its finest. On the ground, Patton's energy drove everything. His speeches before the offensive became legend. "We're not just holding, we're moving." He barked at his staff, his words echoing through the icy air. His chaplain's improvised weather prayer, asking God for clear skies to unleash Allied air power, became a symbol of determination across the front. And among the troops, moral strength spread faster than any order. The story of Bastogne's defenders refusing to surrender became a battle cry for every division pushing north. It wasn't just armor that crossed the forest, it was conviction. Every tank driver who risked sliding into ravines, every engineer who bridged rivers in the dark, every medic who carried a wounded man through snow, they all shared one belief: the line would hold. That belief, multiplied by thousands, turned into movement. Movement turned into momentum. Momentum turned into victory. By the time January came, the Ardennes was no longer a forest of fear. It was a monument to what willpower could achieve against nature, weather, and war itself. The final week of December 1944 marked the true turning of the tide. What began as a desperate defense had become a rolling counteroffensive. The snow-choked forest of the Ardennes now thundered with engines. Patton's Third Army, led by the 4th Armored Division, drove relentlessly north. Their objective was no longer simply to relieve Bastogne, but to crush the German spearhead and restore the front. The breakthrough came in a series of coordinated thrusts. The weather, which had punished the Allies for days, finally shifted. On December 23rd, the clouds broke open to reveal a hard blue sky. It was a gift from above. Allied aircraft, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Typhoons roared into the open air. For the first time since the battle began, the Shermans had their eyes in the sky again. What followed was systematic destruction. Fighter bombers strafed columns of German vehicles trapped on narrow roads. Fuel convoys erupted in sheets of flame. Panthers hidden under tree cover were picked off one by rockets and machine gun fire. The German offensive, already strained, began to disintegrate. On the ground, the U.S. tankers advanced village by village. The 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, later to become one of America's greatest armor commanders, led the charge. His Shermans pushed through icy roads lined with wreckage. Snow burst around them with every shell. In the villages of Chaumont and Assenois, they fought house to house, using their machine guns to clear snipers from attics and church towers. Inside Bastogne, the sound of engines drew closer with every hour. Paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, low on food and ammunition, could hear the distant rumble of the Shermans over the crackle of incoming shells. They held the perimeter like a clenched fist, waiting for that sound to arrive. On December 26th, a column from the 4th Armored Division broke through the final German blockade south of Bastogne. The lead tank, Cobra King, smashed through the enemy line near Assenois just before nightfall. Its crew fired a green flare into the sky, the signal that Bastogne had been reached. The message raced through radios across the front. Bastogne has been relieved. For the men in the foxholes, it was more than a transmission. It was proof that they hadn't been forgotten. The forest, that had once felt like a tomb, now echoed with cheers, gunfire, and the metallic symphony of victory. But the fight was far from over. The Germans were not retreating quietly. The SS Panzer divisions regrouped around Houffalize and Saint-Vith, turning the valleys into killing grounds. The Americans now had to finish what they started, to drive them out completely. For the Shermans, this meant continuous battle in some of the harshest conditions of the war. Crews fought for 10, 12, even 16 hours at a stretch. Engines overheated, frozen oil cracked, machine gun belts jammed from ice. Every mile gained was paid for in steel and blood. Still, they advanced. The momentum that Patton had unleashed refused to stop. Infantry rode on the tank's decks, crouched behind turrets for warmth, while artillery pounded the ridgelines ahead. Each burst lit the snow in orange flashes that faded into cold gray silence. By New Year's Eve, the German spearhead had been blunted. Allied units linked up east of Bastogne, sealing off the bulge that had once threatened the entire front. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions joined the push from the west, closing the trap on the retreating enemy. The forest that once shielded them now betrayed them, its narrow passes choking their withdrawal. Allied air supremacy completed the destruction. Columns of burning panzers dotted the snowfields. Luftwaffe sorties dwindled to nothing. The once fearsome Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble, was collapsing before the world's eyes. The Shermans kept rolling. They had crossed the so-called impassable forest, liberated the besieged, and turned back the tide of war. But ahead lay the final act, the encirclement and annihilation of what remained of the German force. The Ardennes, once a defensive bastion, was about to become their graveyard. January 1945. The world's coldest battlefield stretched from Bastogne to Houffalize, a white expanse scarred by blackened forests and burnt armor. The German offensive had spent its fury, but the retreating enemy still fought with desperation. For the Americans, the mission had changed from survival to pursuit. The 1,500 Shermans that had clawed their way through the Ardennes now became the hammer. Their treads crushed frozen branches and shattered the remains of the Wehrmacht's last hope. Every day, the sound of American engines grew louder. Every night, their headlights moved deeper into German lines, like a slow-moving constellation of steel. The push toward Houffalize, Thiffilly. Key to ending the battle lay in one small town, Houffalize, the heart of the German salient. The plan was elegant in its brutality. The U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies would close in from north and south, cutting off the entire bulge. Patton's armored columns pressed upward from Bastogne. To the north, British and American units under Montgomery descended toward the same objective. Between them lay rivers, mines, and ridges crawling with retreating SS units. But neither side would stop. The Shermans led the way. Their turrets swung left and right, scanning for ambushes in the trees. Snow-covered wrecks of German panzers lined the roads like tombstones. The smell of burnt rubber and fuel hung in the air. The closer they came to Houffalize, the fiercer the resistance. On January 9th, the 6th Armored Division fought its way across the Orthe River under artillery fire. Tanks advanced 2 at a time. bridging engineers working ahead under fire to lay temporary crossings. German guns opened from the heights, but Allied artillery answered with overwhelming weight. Whole ridgelines disappeared under barrages that turned snow into black mud. By mid-January, the jaws of the Allied counterattack began to close. German radio traffic turned frantic. Officers demanded fuel that no longer existed. Many panzers were abandoned, their crews escaping on foot. Prisoners spoke of despair. Men who had believed in Hitler's promise of a final victory now whispering that the war was lost. The collapse when the U.S. 11th Armored Division finally entered. Hufalais on January 16, 1945, they found a landscape of ruin. Burnt-out tanks blocked the streets. Snow drifted through the shattered windows of homes. Civilians emerged cautiously from cellars, faces pale and hollow. Hours later, patrols from the U.S. First Army arrived from the north. The two Allied forces shook hands amid the rubble. The Bulge, the largest German offensive of the Western Front, was sealed shut. It had taken a month of relentless fighting through snow, ice, and forest, but the impossible had been done. The Ardennes, once declared impassable, had been crossed in both directions, first by invaders, then by liberators. The numbers told the story of total reversal. Germany had thrown nearly 30 divisions into the attack, including its last reserves of armor. By January, more than 100,000 men were dead, wounded, or captured. Over 600 tanks and assault guns lay destroyed or abandoned. Entire units simply ceased to exist. The Allies, too, paid heavily. 80,000 casualties, including tankers frozen in their seats or buried under snow. But they had held, and, more importantly, they had proven that no army could match their logistical strength or speed once momentum returned. The turning of the war, the defeat in the Ardennes, broke the last German illusion of victory in the West. Hitler had promised that his offensive would drive the Allies into the sea, split the front, and force a negotiated peace. Instead, it burned through his final fuel reserves, his best divisions, and the last of his strategic initiative. As the surviving German columns retreated toward the Rhine, the U.S. armor did not pause. The Shermans refueled, rearmed, and kept going. Bridges that had been wrecked days earlier were rebuilt overnight. Engineers followed the tanks like shadows, repairing, replacing, rebuilding. On January 25, 1945, Eisenhower officially declared the Battle of the Bulge over. What remained of the German army in the West would never recover. Within weeks, the Allies were preparing for the crossing of the Rhine and the final push into Germany. The Ardennes, once whispered about as a natural fortress, now stood as a symbol of American determination and industrial power. The same ground that had swallowed men and machines in 1940 had now become a highway of liberation. In villages freed from occupation, locals watched endless columns of Shermans roll eastward, engines roaring through the snow. Children waved from doorways. Soldiers threw chocolate bars and rations from the turrets. The war wasn't over yet, but the momentum had shifted forever. The forest that once guarded Germany's western frontier now marked the path to its downfall. When the guns finally fell silent over the Ardennes, the landscape looked less like Europe and more like the surface of another planet. Whole forests were flattened by artillery. Villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to blackened stone. The snow that once lay white now carried the gray ash of burning fuel and the rust of frozen blood. For the Americans, the relief of Bastogne and the destruction of the German offensive marked one of their proudest victories, but also one of their costliest. Between mid-December 1944 and late January 1945, U.S. forces suffered nearly 80,000 casualties, including more than 19,000 dead. It was the bloodiest single battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. Yet despite the losses, morale surged. The impossible had been achieved, not through miracle, but through will, coordination, and endurance. Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters called it a triumph of discipline and logistics over surprise and weather. German losses were catastrophic. Over 100,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. More than 600 tanks, assault guns, and vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. Entire formations, once elite, ceased to exist. The Waffen-SS, having thrown its last reserves into the snow, was broken. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft in failed support missions and never regained air parity. For Hitler, the defeat was personal humiliation. He had promised his generals that the Ardennes would be the strike that split the Allied front and forced peace negotiations. Instead, it burned through his remaining armor, his last stores of fuel, and the final hope of a negotiated end. In his mountain headquarters, he raged at commanders who had once been his protégés. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's warning that Germany lacked the strength to hold after the initial strike had proven prophetic. By January, Rundstedt's situation reports read like obituaries for the Wehrmacht. The Allies, meanwhile, recognized what the victory meant. Patton's success at pivoting the Third Army under impossible conditions became a textbook case of operational flexibility. His tanks had covered over 100 miles through blizzards, engaged in near-continuous combat, and broken a siege thought unbreakable. Eisenhower's coordination of the multinational front, American, British, Canadian, Belgian, and French units, showed how the Allied war machine had matured since 1940. In that forest, chaos had become order. The lessons learned there would shape every offensive that followed. But for the men who fought it, the aftermath was quieter and heavier. Tank crews stepped out of their vehicles for the first time in weeks. They saw the forest stripped bare, trunks splintered, roads carved by tracks and craters. The air still reeked of fuel and cordite. In the villages they liberated, civilians emerged from cellars, thin, pale, eyes blinking against the sunlight. Some wept openly at the sight of the American stars painted on the tanks. In places like Bastogne, families offered the soldiers bread, wine, and gratitude, though they themselves had nothing to spare. Burial details moved through the snowfields, marking rows with simple wooden crosses. There was no music, no speeches, only silence and the scraping of shovels. The Ardennes had consumed tens of thousands of lives, and the survivors carried its echoes long after the shooting stopped. For the Germans, the retreat eastward was not just military. It was psychological. Soldiers marched past the wrecks of their own tanks and trucks, through villages they had promised to liberate again for the Reich. The miracle of the Ardennes that propaganda had promised became known instead as its final delusion. By February 1945, the front stabilized along the Siegfried Line, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Ardennes had drained the last strength from Germany's war machine. What remained was defense and surrender waiting in the shadows. The battle had ended. The consequences were only beginning. The Battle of the Bulge had ended, but its shadow stretched far beyond the snow-covered ridges of Belgium. It was more than just another engagement. It was the last, desperate convulsion of a dying regime and the final demonstration of how overwhelming American power had become. Strategic consequences in Berlin. The defeat at the Ardennes shattered what remained of Hitler's grand illusions. He had wagered everything, his last reserves of fuel, armor, and men, on a single strike meant to divide the Allies and perhaps buy time for a separate peace with the West. Instead, the offensive had bled his army white. From that moment, the Reich fought only to delay the inevitable. The Allied command, on the other hand, emerged hardened and unified. Eisenhower's system of joint command had survived its greatest test. The coordination between Patton's Third Army, Bradley's first, and Montgomery's northern forces had been tense at times, but it proved that the coalition could absorb shock, adapt, and counterpunch as one. The logistical depth that moved 1/500 Shermans through the forest would soon move whole armies across the Rhine. Industrial and psychological power factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh continued to pour out tanks, trucks, and planes faster than Germany could destroy them. Every Sherman lost in the Ardennes could be replaced within days. The same could not be said for the German Panthers burning in the snow. It was the moment when sheer production capacity turned from advantage to inevitability. Psychologically, the battle marked a turning point for both sides. For the Americans, it was proof that their citizen army could withstand the fiercest test of the war and emerge stronger. For the Germans, it was a confirmation of defeat. Prisoners taken in January spoke openly of despair, of letters from home describing bombed cities and empty shelves. Even among SS units, fanaticism began to crack. Human cost and legacy, but no number of tanks or tons of fuel could disguise the human cost. When the snow thawed in March, thousands of bodies were found where the drifts had hidden them. Tankers still inside their burned-out Shermans, infantrymen frozen in foxholes, civilians caught between retreat and advance. The Ardennes became both graveyard and monument. Medics recalled the silence after the battle. No birds, no movement, only the creak of thawing metal. Engineers who had built bridges now dismantled them for scrap. Local villagers buried soldiers from both sides in the same ground, marking graves only with helmets or wooden stakes. Among the Americans who survived, the Ardennes became a defining memory. Veterans spoke less of victory and more of endurance, of the freezing nights, the endless noise, the sight of friends who never made it home. They had fought the elements as fiercely as the enemy, and in doing so proved that modern war was as much about resilience as firepower. The broader war, strategically, the defeat of the Ardennes offensive shortened the war in Europe by months. Within 6 weeks, Allied forces would cross the Rhine. By April, they would meet the Soviets on the Elbe. The Third Reich, once stretching across a continent, now existed only in pockets of resistance. And yet, even as the Allies advanced eastward, the lessons of the Ardennes lingered. Terrain once deemed impregnable had been conquered through organization, adaptation, and unyielding will. It redefined the concept of mobility warfare and became a case study in how technology and logistics could overcome geography itself. In the end, the forest stood as silent witness, snow melted, rivers thawed, and spring returned to the hills of Belgium. But the scars remained, the burned trees, the rusting hulls, and the memory of a winter when men turned a frozen wilderness into the crucible of history. The Ardennes was no longer the place where tanks could not pass. It was the place where they proved they could go anywhere. When the winter of 1944 gave way to spring, the Ardennes returned to silence. Snow melted into the rivers where tanks once crossed, and the forest, scarred by fire and steel, began to breathe again. But nothing in Europe would ever be the same. The Battle of the Bulge had been more than a clash of armies. It was a confrontation between belief and endurance, between those who trusted in terrain and those who trusted in will. The Germans had gambled on geography, on the idea that nature could defend them when manpower and fuel could not. The Americans answered with movement, adaptation, and an iron conviction that no obstacle was permanent. In that sense, the battle was not only military, but philosophical. It showed that modern warfare was no longer ruled by static lines or natural defenses. The true power lay in coordination, in the invisible threads connecting factories, fuel convoys, engineers, pilots, and soldiers into one living organism. The Sherman tank was not just a machine of war. It was the symbol of a nation that had learned to turn industry into endurance. When the last Sherman rolled out of the Ardennes, its tracks left more than scars in the snow. They left a message that courage multiplied by organization can bend even the harshest landscape to human will. For the men who survived, the forest would remain in memory. The sound of frozen engines, the smell of fuel in the cold, the faces of those who didn't return. Yet they had witnessed something greater than victory. They had seen what happens when ordinary soldiers, from farms and factories, stand against the full weight of history and push it back 1 mile at a time. In the years that followed, the Ardennes would grow quiet again. The trees would regrow over the shattered ground, covering the remnants of war. But beneath that soil lie the tracks of 1,500 Shermans, and the proof that sometimes the hardest roads lead to history's most enduring triumphs. The Germans said no tank could cross the Ardennes. The Americans didn't listen. They simply drove forward.